Welcome back. For those just joining us, I'm Joseph Mike. I'm the director of the Climate Change, Energy Security and Climate Change program here at CSIS. For those in the room, thanks so much for accommodating us as we shuffled our schedule around a little bit this morning, or this earlier in the program. In this second half, hopefully we have a little more time to incorporate questions and participation, both from those in the room as well as those joining online. The early sessions we heard about U.S. efforts around clean energy manufacturing. What can we do well? How do we tie this to social outcomes, to the labor market? How do we look at the sort of existing policy landscape? With Rep. Kim, we heard about sort of a realignment of U.S. foreign policy and commercial diplomacy around not just energy issues, but critical minerals and a variety of other goods necessary for a thriving and secure world. In this session, I want us to listen a little more. We've got three folks who can give us a sense of what's happening outside of Washington. And then we've got Jonah who can help us understand what's going on inside Washington. Because one of the themes that we touched on very early in the day is that the U.S. has undergone a significant change in policy emphasis over the last 6 months, but the world is moving on in very different ways. And so hopefully what we get out of today's conversation is two things. One, a picture of what our trading partners and our allies are thinking as it comes to energy. And two, and a better understanding of how the tools that we've developed here in the United States, which we're using to strong effect to deploy innovative and low carbon technologies, can be diffused throughout the world. I think sometimes the U.S. doesn't get enough credit, if I can put on my America hat very briefly, for how much change we drive, the good policy mechanisms we create. And we don't want to just export widgets or nuclear technology. We want to export successful policy models as well. It's a big part of what institutions like CSIS are about, figuring out what's working and how do we diffuse best practices around the world. So with that in mind, please do help me welcome my excellent and esteemed panel. Jules Besnénou, who will correct me on the pronunciation of his last name if I've messed it up, joins us online. He's the Executive Director of Clean Tech for Europe. Just to my left here, Francesco Maria Graziani is the Counselor for the Climate and Energy Innovation at the Delegation of the European Union here in Washington. Jonah Wagner is the President and Co-Founder of Constructive. Jonah was formerly the Chief of Staff at the DOE's LPO, and he's going to tell us today a little bit around Constructive is going to do. And Damien Doyle joins us on the end there, Counselor for the Australian Embassy, again covering climate and energy issues, but Damien has a long history covering trade and international affairs. Jules, maybe we can begin with you since the connection is live and working. The U.S. has experienced such an incredible change over the last 8 months. You and I first met 4 months ago in Brussels, talking about how the EU was thinking about navigating the challenges it faced. It's trying to stand up a little bit more on its own. There is strong climate ambition still within the European Union, but the EU also faces significant competitiveness challenges regarding energy pricing and industry. Can you give us a picture of where you are today and what you'd like the Washington audience to understand?
Absolutely, and thanks so much, Joseph, for having us. And may I say it's fantastic to have European voices on a panel called Fast Followers. I don't know if we're followers, we're definitely not fast, but it's really fantastic to be in that included in that group. So look, what's the latest in Brussels? I think we're really at a critical juncture, at a bit of a turning point. If you picture the previous European Commission, so 2019 to 2024, basically, it was the Green Deal Commission, right? But the reality is that it was much more about green than about deal, meaning there was a real disalignment between climate strategy, climate policy, and industrial policy on the other side. And only very far and late into the mandate did we start to put two and two together and to start to try to align climate and industrial policy. Now, this new European mandate only started a bit less than a year ago. And as you say, the climate ambitions are still very, very high. We're actually still coming up with new climate targets, including for 2040. But there's a clear desire now to start to introduce some flexibility into how we get there, how we get to these targets. And more importantly, we've now added two really critical prisms on our climate and industry targets. One is, how do we become more competitive? And you started talking about high energy prices, but we also have to figure out how to join up our fragmented internal markets, and also how to mobilize private and public capital. And it's true for legacy industries, but it's also true for new technologies. And then the second important prism is, how does our climate agenda also meet our security agenda? And obviously the high energy prices are very tied to the war in Ukraine. But increasingly, we also talk about high security risks for our energy infrastructure. So it's really, I think the latest in Brussels is how do we move not away from climate, but how do we combine competitiveness and security dimensions to our climate policy?
Francesco, maybe we can turn to you for the official perspective, right? So, I think you live in Washington, you're talking to people here all the time. There is the real impression that Europe has overcommitted on climate and has made itself uncompetitive because of that. How do you answer that? What's your answer to that? And what is your view on what the ambition of the European Union is on these matters?
No, thank you, Joseph, to you personally and CSIS for this opportunity. It's always great to be here. And I think that Jules already said it all, so I think I can just stand up and go. He gave already the Brussels mantra, if you wish, but I can probably add something to that from my official position.
From your war-weary days in Washington, D.C.?
Days in Washington, D.C. And by the way, you're the last obstacle between me and my European summer break tonight, starting tonight, so you have a big responsibility for that. Still a pleasure to be here. But I wanted to focus on the shift, because you frame the issue as climate action, then harming competitiveness, therefore the industrialization and so on. I'm oversimplifying, but that's a point behind that. We passed from 2019 the European Green Deal. Then at the end of the first von der Leyen Commission, we had already a bit of a shift when we started talking about the Green Industrial Deal. And then now we are at the beginning of the second von der Leyen Commission, and we are in full Clean Industrial Deal perspective. So I think what we're living is, and this is a perfect segue to what you said before, framing this discussion, that sometimes American companies, the American system doesn't receive enough credit for, let's say, the innovation that it brings to also outside the US. When I arrived here in DC, it was November 23, and as Europeans, we were still under a bit of shock because of the massive IRA subsidies. That we were still trying, after a year, to understand if it was more just a climate law, if it was a purely protectionist law, or just something in between, being like an industrial policy legislation. It probably turned out to be a bit of everything of this, but what really struck me is that the day I arrived, I went to the Meridian, and there was this intervention by David Livingston, and he was very close to John Podesta at the time, and he said, the incredible technological dividend that the US, let's say, innovation in clean tech will bring about to the rest of the world will inspire the rest of industrial policy legislations around the world. And that's what's happened actually in Europe. Now we are probably living, the pendulum is swinging a bit back, so from the strong push to the European Green Deal, now we are in very, very much industrial policy nuts and bolts, I would say. And there we are really trying to find the tools to, we're already deploying the tools to make good of the promises under, or the assessment and the promises done under the Draghi report.
Right.
So how to really push competitiveness, how to regain competitiveness, and to keep competitiveness.
Right.
This in the juncture of a world where energy security means resilience, means also addressing climate change.
Excellent, thank you. Let's go to Damien. Damien, you've got a new government in Australia. What's the headline for thinking in this new government on when it comes to energy, climate change, balancing security, competitiveness? Are we the only country that feels this is a new world?
Thanks CSIS for inviting me to this panel of climate bros. Yes, Australia has a new government. It's a returned government, and it has a surprise, it has an increased parliamentary majority. So, you know, in the first term of the Labor government in Australia, we talked about having policy certainty by legislating climate targets. And I think now, with a returned government in another term, I think we can talk about policy durability and putting the meat on the bones of the legislative framework that was established. So, I mean, the headline statements would be that Australia established a legislated target of net zero by 2050 and set about designing a framework to deliver that through emissions reduction and decarbonisation. We're in the process, and it should be published soon, of finalising a net zero plan, which is a government guidance document that supports the net zero legislated target and provides guidance and, I guess, policy guidance and technology guidance to businesses and researchers and communities and investors about what the pathway is to get where we're going. But I think, in the spirit of frank comments that we've had so far, we're also at a point where we've realised how bloody hard the energy transition is. It's not easy, and you're actually redesigning the fundamentals of a system that's underpinned your economy for so long. And my minister, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, is fond of saying, just because it's hard doesn't mean we're not going to do it. And I think that's a reflection of the way that the Australian government thinks about our energy transition and our place in the world as a strategic opportunity. You know, we've always been a trading nation. Our future will depend on having export sectors that the world demands, and that's going to depend on us working our way through a lot of challenges like hydrogen and green metals and a lot of other technical challenges as well as economic ones. So the rubber has hit the road. We know how hard the energy transition is, and like the Europeans, we're going to test and adjust. We need to be realistic about that. But all of this, I think, is part of the reason that Australia has pursued so doggedly its bid to host COP31 in 2026 in partnership with Pacific Islands. And that'll be a chance not just to talk about our energy transition and how hard it is, but to also elevate Pacific voices as they deal with their challenges.
You know, we heard the conversation earlier between Representative Kim and Naveen Girashankar, our president here at CSIS, focused a lot on ASEAN countries, a lot on the value of partnerships for things like establishing critical minerals supply chains, building out value chains for clean technology and a variety of other goods. You know, when you hear that conversation, do you sense opportunity? Does Australia sense opportunity in partnership with the United States, even though our trade policy has gotten more bellicose over the last 8 months? You know, it seems to me that there's the market opportunity on either side is still too much to give away.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think since the election outcome, a lot of people in Australia were adopting a wait-and-see approach to the Trump administration's second go at it. And I think that's still true to an extent, but the broad thrusts of where the administration's interests lie and don't lie, what its priorities are becoming clearer. The Pacific is fundamental to Australia's security, whether we're talking about energy or security more broadly, and so is Southeast Asia. Yes, there are tremendous opportunities there. So in the Pacific, there are opportunities for public-private partnerships, not just for climate resilience and energy transition, but for basic infrastructure, and also just for a strategic presence, being that partner of choice that we heard about earlier.
Let's bring Jonah into the conversation. So, Jonah, maybe we can start hearing a little bit more about what Constructive is doing, but also I'd love to hear your thoughts coming out of government service, but really being at the tip of the spear for innovative public policy. Kind of when you hear opportunities as expressed, you know, what do you hope people from abroad learn from the U.S.?
Well, thank you, Joseph. Thanks to CSIS for having me and for having us here. Gosh, I get a lot out of listening to the three of you talk about your plans and ambitions. And part of why we created Constructive was as a hopeful act. So I was chief strategist at the Loan Programs Office at a time when the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and we were sort of at the forefront of the largest investment by any government in clean energy and climate ever. And I think when we started Constructive, it was out of a recognition that we learned quite a few things about what it looks like to build conviction within the private sector around investing into real projects, real steel in the ground, that is durable. And I think, you know, we've all borne witness to how the pendulum can swing on policy. I think one of the big differences potentially between the US and what we see in particular in Europe and the UK is while in the US there is economic logic behind investing in clean energy and climate, it's not necessarily existential. Whereas in Europe and the UK, when you look at commodity trading around energy, even if you don't have to look very far to see the conflict in Russia and Ukraine to realize why Europe and the UK are not going to back off these commitments. And in an environment where companies and investors are looking for certainty, I think the ability to double down on that articulation is quite powerful. And so at Constructive, what we're doing is we're an independent nonprofit. And what we've done is basically take the models that we developed at DOE, which are best encapsulated by, if you're familiar with the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff reports that we wrote technology by technology and the Deploy Summits that we hosted. What we realized was that a big part of what it actually takes to build momentum for developing projects is a level of trust and understanding between the private sector and the public sector. And the other thing we realized is that for any of these technologies to be competitive, the private sector must be in the driver's seat. That we couldn't be the ones saying, and thou shalt build X, Y, Z. What we could do was say, we're your partners. And we're going to make these tools as understandable and unbureaucratic as possible, which is very hard to do. And we're going to basically set up the system so that you can drive your ambition. And so this idea of private sector-led, government-enabled became a cornerstone of our projects. And I think there's a few lessons embedded in this, and I'm sure we can get into it, that I think will be quite important for the UK, for Europe, for Australia, as you execute against these very bold top-down industrial strategies that have been laid out.
Jules, let's bring you back in. When you hear private sector-led, government-enabled, can that work in Europe?
I think it would be very challenging, right? If I take maybe a bit of a wider picture, I think there's how to work in the private sector, right? But there were, in our minds, two other critical elements in the U.S. kind of arsenal under Joe Biden, right? One was very clear production-based support that sends both a demand and an investment signal. There's the public de-risking that the loan programs office put together, right, with these large public loans to companies. And then, as Jonas says, there's then how you work in the private sector to kind of co-invest and believe in these investment cases, right? I would say we're trying to emulate this in Europe. You're starting to have more and more discussion around some of these production-based support. It's still not kind of native to how we do things, so it's complicated. But the hope is that we would be able to put something like that together in our next budget. The de-risking, I think we're okay at it. We could definitely get better at the kind of loans and guarantees part of things. We have a weird habit of doing a lot of granting. But then bringing in the private sector is likely the most challenging for the most bureaucratic continent, right? So I think there, the best thing that the EU can do is really set as clear demand signals as possible for clean technologies, and that could look like production-based support. It could also look like a much stronger trade policy that gives a clear preference to EU equipment. And with that kind of clear demand signal, I think it would be much easier to crowd in a private sector capital. I think beyond the US, we can also look at other geographies that have done really interesting policy moves. And the one that comes to mind when we have this discussion is always Japan, where they've started to put in a carbon pricing system that looks a bit like what we already do in the EU, and that's great. That's going to meet a lot of CBAM requirements. But they've added a really interesting kind of financial engineering twist on this, which is that they've been able to borrow against future carbon revenues and use that money to invest in clean technologies now. So I think even beyond the US, there may be other geographies where we can try to pick things and learn from.
Francesco, again, turning to you, so if the big story is, while the U.S. is kind of de-emphasizing climate, we have this energy dominance agenda, so much of the energy system now is also clean energy, right? That's where almost all the innovation is happening. You've got a ton of human capital here in the States that have developed new companies, developing solutions. After the IRA, one of the things we saw with those huge subsidies that you mentioned was money pouring into the United States from Europe, from Japan, from other countries. Do we now think about an era where a lot of these solutions that have come out of the US are going to start being adopted abroad? How should the US private sector look at allies and Western partners as places to bring novel and innovative technologies?
That's the key question, in my view, because the moment we look at what happened with the IRA, we didn't see a crowding out of investments from other jurisdictions into the US, but we saw a bigger pie.
Yeah.
Okay? So like more funds going into clean tech rather than just moving from one jurisdiction to the other. And we count on this happening also now, probably like with Europe being, again, a front runner in this, let's say, attraction kind of force, mainly because of three things, okay? So we have, let's say, as Jonah mentioned, a very predictable and stable regulatory framework, okay? So now we have all the tools there to be implemented, are being implemented under our Critical Raw Material Act. The Commission just finalized like the first 47 strategic projects that are actually open to all all allies from around the world, so also like US companies, like Brazilian companies, Canadian companies, and so on, Australian companies. And so let's say we create that stable framework where investors and companies, not all European companies, but companies around the world, know that they will find like this predictability and from now to 2030, 35 and 40, in order to have their business decisions, first point. Second point, what a bit Jules was referring to, we actually just adopted, 25th of June, I think, so really very recently, the new framework for state aid on the Clean Industrial Deal space, which means that all those loan guarantees like operating costs and so on are part now of our own, say, commission-based, European Commission-based framework for us to, let's say, inform member states' decisions on publicly subsidizing clean tech industry. Right. So again, still part of the regulatory framework, stability, but also like we have like the clear financial tools now in place.
Yeah,
third and last point, like research.
Right.
There we have like a huge inflow of researchers and scientists coming from all over the world, and mostly the US, especially now, because we have a clear path ahead of us in terms of like how to attract researchers. Right. So let's say this, in our view, will create the ecosystem of the future for which Europe is again competitive and attractive.
And so if I have my like sort of U.S. policy hat on, I hear Jules talk about the sort of the most bureaucratic continent. I didn't say it; he did. Where do you sense, like, where should the U.S. private sector, where should the U.S. as in this matter, in this sort of new commercial diplomacy, look for give, right? Where if we're going to be successful, like I'm not saying like the ETS has to go away. In fact, that seems important to the whole task. But do you see, or maybe Jules can answer as well, like where is the give going to be that allows capital to flow, allows the kind of risk-taking that Jonah's talking about to become a bigger part of the developments we hope to see?
I would say engagement at the two levels, like authority, so government to government and business to business. Yeah. So government to government, we have already like a very good engagement with authorities, for example, at DOE, in trying to understand where they consider the non-tariff barriers being, and us explaining where first of all, there are not non-tariff barriers, but where a potential trade area could be, how we can go beyond that. I'm, of course, referring to the methane regulation there, the union database and so on, so that where there is like a substantial amount of flaws, like in LNG, for example, we don't have actually irritants there, but we have the possibilities to explore where the decarbonized production of US already could create like an advantage for US industry rather than a disadvantage. And then business to business, I think we have to increase our possibilities that we look at the transatlantic market as a real matchmaking platform, so that we put together all the synergies that already exist between businesses in the two sides of the Atlantic. I was in CERAWeek, and clearly there was an outpour of interest for American software-based and AI-based companies in having, in accessing European market for example, like demand response, heat pumps, and so on, so that, let's say, the good hardware where Europeans are mostly front runners could match the good software where American companies could be front runners. That's just an example. Right. So our task as well as European Union delegation here and the different delegations in the world is to make this matchmaking possible.
Damien, similar question to you, sort of how is the Australian government thinking about engagement with the US and our private sector when it comes to clean tech? I mean, we've had several notable examples of US clean tech innovators coming and keeping that grid online. What do you see as the next phase of this kind of engagement, and how should we be looking for productive paths forward?
I think in Australia, it's more about creating an enabling environment that invites everybody in, and we'd love that to be, clean tech startups from the States. But I say that because that great big challenge of the energy transition that I mentioned before makes it feel sometimes like our R&D focus is everywhere all at once. There's just so many challenges. But when you look at it closer, there's probably three big areas of R&D and innovation need that we want to create the right conditions for. So the first is about realising that opportunity to be a renewable energy superpower, which means things like green metals and hydrogen-derived products, all the exports of the future for a global economy. The second area is about the hard-to-abate sectors, the hard-to-abate industries in Australia, which tend to have been located in regional Australia. So they're communities and workers and businesses that have been around a long time. They're cement facilities and steel facilities, and they've got really tricky decarbonisation challenges, and that's where public research and private partnerships are so important. It's an industry-led initiative to unlock the decarbonisation technologies that they need, and we have a number of different mechanisms for that. And then the third one is about the grid. So the massive renewables build out that is required, whether it's interconnection and transmission, but also just distributed energy resources as well. We have a really high penetration of rooftop solar in Australia. And we're moving now into home batteries as well. That opens up a lot of opportunities for balancing the grid and providing affordability and reliability, but it also presents technical challenges. And so, there's a growing focus now on grid enhancing technologies, and I know that that's a focus in different parts of the states as well that have similar challenges to us in integrating renewables at large scale or in a distributed scale. So, making clear what those priorities are is the first thing. So that there's a focus area for innovators and entrepreneurs. And the second thing is the enabling environment. So knowing exactly the direction of travel in terms of policy is very important, but also having a series of institutions in place that can provide that de-risking support and bring public and private sector players together. So the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, for example, is essentially a green bank with a very specialised lending mandate, and it will support large-scale projects, 20 million or more, whether they're critical minerals processing or large-scale solar deployment or grid enhancements. And there's other examples of institutions that are all now aligned behind the mission of achieving 2050. So it's creating a system where you know the direction of travel and the support's there to get you there.
I hear lending institutions at the boundary of the public and the private sector, helping to activate investment and move projects forward, and immediately I think DOE, LPO. And I also, I think we have to recognize that while it grew and was really sort of revived under the Biden administration, that certainly the Trump administration has its own, has its eyes on LPO as a successful model, right? It's in the president's budget. It's won support in Congress. Jonah, when you hear the other countries looking for this, just what are the top three things, you think like these sort of intermediary financing and risk offsetting institutions need to do to really like drive change, whether it's for climate, security, or economic development?
Yeah, you shared that question with me in advance, and so I gave it some thought, and I want to answer it slightly differently, if that's okay, which is three sort of lessons from what we were trying to do with LPO, because I think the model we had will vary in Europe and in Australia for what works. But I think the three lessons that I took away that I think we did our best to implement against is, number one, see the world as it is and not as you wish it to be. Number two, if you build it, they may or may not come. And number three, remember that markets don't build projects, people do. And innovators and entrepreneurs do. And so on the first one, see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. I think what we realized really early on is politics and policy don't actually dictate what's a good project to invest in, right? You actually have to get real world data. And when you engage with the private sector, you can't engage with the private sector on promises about what you will do in the future. You can only engage with them with what you can do for them today. And those two things, I think, those are actually sort of part of why we ended up writing the liftoff reports, is we didn't actually know what the private sector thought and what was real on the ground. And so we felt like we needed to get a much better data set so that we could figure out how to bring our tools to bear. The second, if you build it, they may or may not come. I think, the LPO had $40 billion of loan authority sitting there for almost a decade, and we did not make one single new loan over that period. Authority was there. I think we got one application a quarter over that period. Within a year of the Biden administration coming in, we were getting 2 applications a week, and we had $70 billion in our pipeline seeking $40 billion. This was before the IRA passed. And what we realized was you actually had to hire a team that had a network that could go out and tell these applicants to apply because they knew how valuable the debt was. You couldn't just say, we have this cool debt, like we have this cool new instrument that's going to be useful. You actually had to call a human being and say, no, literally, I know the underlying economics of your project, we can help you. Come in the door. And then lastly, markets don't build projects, people do. I think one of the big challenges we had was the companies that understand how to navigate government are incumbents. They have a government affairs person, they have free cash flows. Their investors are expecting 6 to 8% returns every single year. So the way that they are positioned, they're not actually breaking the mold. They're moving incrementally in a direction. They have a very important role to play. The companies that actually have the risk appetite and have the risk capital backing them, the ones that want them to shoot the moon, those are the growth companies. Those are the guys who don't have the cash. They don't know how. They don't have a government affairs person, right? Their CEOs are, have a little something's screws a little bit loose, right? Like these guys are mortgaging their houses to bet on their businesses, right? Those are the guys who they may not succeed, but they're not going to come to the table willingly. They are skeptical. They think government's an obstacle. And we had to go out and overcome a serious trust deficit to get them in the room. And I think that trust deficit is something that I think will be true in every context, especially in daunting regulatory environments.
And you hear, and just to carry that further and connect it to the conversation we heard earlier, it's so much of the path to success for these kind of instruments is like just showing up, communicating clearly what you want and what you can do. And I think that we will find in our last panel that theme echoed in the international context as well, right? So much of of driving success is actually just like leaving the think tank and going and doing the thing. Colleagues, we have a few minutes. If any of you have a question for one of our panelists, or you're dying to hear a perspective from the EU, from Australia, we'd love to give you a chance to do so. Do recall that a question has a brief prepositional statement and then a sentence which goes up at the end. Yes, and if you wouldn't mind, there's a microphone. Do introduce yourself and if you have an institutional affiliation that you care to share.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. My name is Maya. I'm working for a think tank called African Tech Futures Lab. And I have a question for Jonah. You mentioned that you need to build conviction in the private sector. So I was wondering, how have you seen that being successful in the field, or how to empower people to go and build innovation, especially in the energy field?
Thank you for the question. So the private sector in the US, the companies that we engaged with were already ambitious, right? They had big plans. They were going places. The thing we had to convince them of was by working with us, they could go faster, bolder than they would have otherwise. And the first step was convincing them that we weren't going to drag them down. And I think that is an underappreciated role of government, is to make it as easy as possible, but not more so, to get through it, so that you are enabling the private sector to achieve the ambitions that it already has, that its investors already have.
Others? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Dave Boehme from Energy Materials Corporation. Question for our EU friends here. Is there within the EU structure of the ones I know about, like ENZIA, the Green Deal, is there support for first of its kind, innovative manufacturing that gets over that valley of death that's such a problem here in the US?
Thank you for the question. Actually, it's a very important question. At those stages, so very in incubators, very innovative phases, yes, we have tools to support those specific companies, but they're more on the research side. On the we have the Horizon Europe, we have InnovateU, like several tools that are, I wouldn't say they're necessarily part on ZIA or the Critical Raw Materials Act, but they're more at the third pillar that I was referring to, the research pillar on the side, where Europe has always been like at the forefront in terms of like public funding of research, unlike the US, where there's a lot of like incubators that are being financed by the capital markets, basically. But Europe, let's say the public funding of those startup and or like a pre-market phases companies usually comes out of like public funding schemes. Yes.
So I heard the question to be a bit later stage, right? On first of a kind funding, in which case there are these types of schemes. You won't find one that is as kind of large and I would say private sector friendly as the LPO had, but you still have a couple of options. One is the EU Innovation Fund, which is a large fund that uses proceeds from the carbon market to then give away grants for first-of-a-kind projects. It's significant amounts. The issue is the success rate is actually quite low, and the effort to apply is quite high. A couple of other options that you have. One is to work with the European Investment Bank that has a strong kind of venture debt program that also now offers working capital guarantees. So with the two put together, you can actually do some interesting first-of-a-kind projects. And then the last option is to work directly with individual member states, where in a lot of cases they have a national public bank that is able to support first-of-a-kind projects, typically either with a grant or with some kind of loan guarantee.
We've got two questions up here. Oh, three. We'll go here.
Yes, thank you. I had a question for the panel. I'm Robert Lanza from ICF. I'm wondering about the role of private sector investors. You said that private sector investors generally, they're looking for 6-8% return. Are there risk-taking private investors. I know that fusion is attracting private sector investment. Is that true in clean energy, or are we in this realm where it's going to be a government loan program?
So to clarify, are you asking specifically about for emerging clean energy technologies or just clean tech?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. I'm happy to start, and then others should jump in. So I think when and maybe we had an overly simplified view of the world at the Loan Programs Office, but generally speaking, there were the large pools of infrastructure equity, pension funds, asset managers, those are the guys who are looking for 6 to 8% returns on their equity investments. And those are funds, obviously, that are underpinned by, firemen's pensions and everything else, right? So they have to get a pretty stable return. On the other end of the spectrum, you have venture, but venture capital is a much smaller pool of capital. And then in between, you have growth equity. And so there are larger funds that are looking for closer to 15, 20%, maybe 30% IRRs, and then commercial debt layers on top. I think for what we were trying to do at the Loan Programs Office was operate as what we called a bridge to bankability. So effectively stepping in and improving the returns for your growth equity players, and in some cases, pension funds, such that they were able to achieve their target returns and shift some of that risk onto the government. And the idea was, once you've built the first few of these things, then you've started to create a demand profile you've started the demand signal, you're starting to get the economies of scale in the manufacturing base, you're moving down the learning curve in your unit economics, and that creates that flywheel, and you can access the larger pools of low-cost equity and then also commercial debt. And I think figuring out how to make that flywheel work, I think what we found was, it's not a generic thing that you slap on to each technology in each region. It's highly specific to the technology and the region that you're investing in, and it has everything to do with the local regulatory environment, with the feedstock, with the supply chain, with the workforce, with the demand signal, everything, electricity prices, all matters in terms of how you de-risk it and create that bridge.
Why don't we come up to the front, the lady in the front, and then the gentleman here in the... Yeah, well, they'll move while you...
I might just add to that there's a bit of personality in it as well. So I can think of a couple of Australian examples. One would be Fortescue, Andrew Forrest's company, which is an incumbent for most purposes, but is also taking a lot of risks on things like dual fuel shipping using ammonia or hydrogen electrolyser manufacture. So Twiggy doesn't just have a big vision and a big personality, but he's also got a thick skin. So when he cancels one of those projects and realises that it's not going to work and fails fast, which is what we're all told we should do, to innovate, he's resistant. He doesn't care about the criticism, whereas other companies would be really concerned about that. The other approach is to be very quiet. So there's another Aussie company I could think of that is developing a portfolio of renewably powered data centres. They're not making any fanfare about it. They want to get it right before their first announcement, and they're taking all the risks where no one can see them. So I think it's just about the risk appetite, and sometimes individual personality is a big part of it.
Hi, Ruslana Kochmar. Thank you so much for such a great conversation. I'm an energy policy and market strategist at the Longenecker and Associates, which is like a small business consulting firm that is supporting DOE. And so I had a question to Joanna, probably mostly, but how do you make sure that you create this certainty in the market of such a huge uncertainty? As we have seen from the European side, there was not truly crowding out type of effect, but rather kind of like an increase in pipeline. But now, with the diminishing potential appetite in the clean energy tech investments in the United States, what are some tools and strategies that you can leverage apart from commercial liftoffs, maybe adoption readiness levels, and what are your current ways of how you're helping the domestic market to kind of remain afloat and not just kind of initiate this immediate transfer to the European market? So thank you very much.
So maybe I'll share one thought, and then Jules, maybe I can bring you in as my counterpart. here. I think we invested a great deal in sort of creating an environment, I think, of what we thought was certainty here in the US. And I think we did it by sort of, you know, in every way we knew how, right? We had proof points about what it looks like to invest in it. We showcased it, we talked about it, we brought folks in, and we created blueprints and roadmaps, and we did we took so many different steps to create that certainty. And as you say, you know, trust is built in a lifetime and lost in a day. And I think part of the challenge that you have, and where we're regrouping now in the US, is to figure out what is, and I think we've all learned a really important lesson around policy shifts here, which is what is the through line that is resilient, right? Because as Joseph mentioned, right, nuclear, we invested a great deal over the last 4 years in building conviction in a thriving and competitive US nuclear industry, and that continues. Same goes for next generation geothermal. I think through the liftoff work and the stuff we did with Fervo and Ever and others, I'd say we took a very small amount of funding that we had for this technology and we turned it into actually a juggernaut. And I think it's going to be an extraordinary success story in the US and eventually an export market. And then I think we made some serious progress on virtual power plants, grid enhancing technologies, moving sort of out of the pilot, death by 1,000 pilots into actually a maturation. But I do think that this is one of those moments where there's a lot more technologies than those. And I think creating an environment of certainty is going to be harder now in the US than it has in the past. And so I think we are working towards finding those things that we feel confident will be consistent year to year. And Jules, maybe I kick it to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reflection on my side is if I'm a US clean tech company right now, you know, I look towards Europe, and I see a very large potential market, clear climate targets, a good carbon pricing system that is likely going to drive demand. But I also see a place that is incredibly hard to figure out, right? Like where should I even set up my business? What's the difference between Italy, Germany, Sweden, et cetera, when you start to talk about energy markets, for instance? And then what are kind of available pots of capital? How do I get to know all the different schemes, et cetera, et cetera? So, all in all, I think we still have a lot of work to do in Europe to have a clear lending zone and to be an attractive kind of place to do business. And I think a bit to your question, Joseph, also on kind of what has to give, right? And so for me, it would be these two things. One is, how do we reduce complexity? How do we make it easy for companies to lend in Europe? And then on the fragmentation side as well, how do we reduce the fragmentation of our markets so that when a US company looks towards Europe, it doesn't see 27 markets, but one market of 450 million consumers. So yeah, still got a long ways to go, but we're working on it.
People interested in that concept and sort of how the European market can kind of coalesce without losing national sovereignty should check out the work my colleague Max Bergman and I have done under the title Power Plays, which is about U.S. and European collaboration on energy security and clean energy. And that's been a big theme in our research. Even published a paper on that question, on some of those questions last week. We're going to do a final question here, and then we will wrap this panel.
I wanted to throw in a question about AI because I think in the past, maybe in your December summit, there was this issue about transmission of electricity is one of the big problems, that the AI supercenters sort of need huge amounts of energy, but also some of the AI supercenters may be designed to be 25 times more energy efficient than others. So how does this all come together? Are there particular cases of supercenters which have been designed well from both the energy and the supercenter point of view? And how does this work both in America and also in Europe, where the whole of, attitude to AI seems to have changed in the last couple of months, at least with the Macron-London summits?
Maybe I can, I'll begin with the first answer. I think that, if I may, Jonah raised the question of what are constants? And I think whether it's the United States or Europe or Australia, China, one of the constants we're going to see over the next few years is like a shift from an academic understanding that we're now electrifying the world to the realization that we are electrifying the world, and that is going to come with a ton of frictions. In the United States, that conversation is being forced by AI more than anything else. So whether, and our ability to kind of change regulation and get the private sector on board for actually building a resilient and affordable and growing electricity system in the United States is critical for AI, but it's critical for every other goal that we have related to economic security, climate change, what have you. And I think that like we're feeling the sort of we're at the trough right now in the U.S. and kind of existential worry about this issue. We're going to climb our way out of it, and I think a lot of countries are going to be fast followers in that context as Europe or others start these chips and other things start diffusing out into the world. That I think is like one of the constants we're going to see, and what it's going to require is that all the innovative technologies we're talking about right now, grid enhancing tools, clean firm power, the things that are going to continue to get support from the USG are going to be essential tools in success. Francesco.
Yes, very important question as well. Actually, fast followers. We are fast followers, as the panel says. In Europe, we just closed the public consultation, actually, on, let's say, delivering on our AI continent plan, action plan. Because at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year, we as serial regulators, and we are, as we are accused of being, we will create a regulatory framework on how to make, let's say, the internal market work under all perspectives for AI enhancement.
He's been reading my blogs.
Right. Right. Sometimes I do. Obviously, we don't just need like the regulatory side of things, but also like a bit of a political push, and the good old Macron is always like a good marketing tool, let's say.
All right, colleagues, thank you so much for your kind attention. Would you please offer your warm thanks to our panelists? We have a 5-minute recess for resetting the stage. If you need to take a break for nature, exit the room, take a turn to the right, and we'll see you here in a few minutes. Thank you so much, gentlemen.